Good morning and a warm welcome to a few discussions on the different issues in Paradise Lost, Book 1. Please remember that we'll restrict ourselves to Paradise Lost, Book 1, and we are not going to talk about the other books of Paradise Lost. The first issue we shall discuss is the role of Satan in Paradise Lost. Now, in Paradise Lost, Book 1, Milton begins in medias res, and therefore he begins with the fall of Satan in hell and the regeneration of the fallen angels under the leadership of Satan. So, right at the beginning of the text, Satan is placed squarely at the center and therefore attracts significant attention in books 1 and 2. Milton seems to imbue Satan with a degree of heroism, both in terms of determination and in terms of leadership. And therefore, one can argue that Milton's Satan seems to be a figure of freedom, resistance against tyranny, rather than a figure of evil and the binary of the divine. In fact, William Blake was of the idea that Milton was of the devil's party without admitting it, without knowing it. And successive generations of critics, including the Romantics, have seen Satan essentially as a Promethean character who is toiling against God's tyranny, and therefore essentially the hero of Book 1 of Paradise Lost. However, a careful study of Paradise Lost, Book 1, suggests that there are many layers to Satan's character. The first and foremost aspect that Milton provides to Satan is a recurrence of the element of misery, despair, and defeat. If we take a look at Satan's posture when he's lying in this chaotic uh, pool of hell, his body is compared in successive epic similes to Leviathan, to the Titans, finally to an island where a sailor moors his boat. But the very fact that he's prostrate signifies a defeated Satan. So ultimately, the poem begins with Satan's defeat, and several, of the speeches where Satan poses as a hero, the element of this misery at having lost heaven, a state of perfection, seems to bubble over. In fact, Satan keeps on harping about the perfection that he has lost, about the state of heaven as that ethereal state. And therefore, quite clearly, the Satan that we see in Paradise Lost is an embittered and a defeated individual, or archangel, not an individual. The second thing that we notice in Satan's speeches is the element of despair. Now, he is conscious of this darkness, he is conscious that his fellows have all fallen, and out of that despair, Satan's aim is to create or regenerate a sense of hope. Milton seems to use the Dantesque version of hell here, where, hope never enters, as it were. But Milton differs from Dante also in that Satan's speeches all seek to cross over from this state of despair into a state of hope. Satan's chief characteristic, however, in Paradise Lost is his power of rhetoric. We might also mention how Satan is created in terms of the epic adversary of God. Milton not only talks about his bulk, he talks about Satan's ponderous shield, he talks about Satan's spear, which is like the tallest pine tree. Therefore, very consciously, Milton is building Satan up as the binary of God in heroic terms. In doing so, one feels that Milton is falling back upon the epic tradition where the battle between good and evil is seen as a monumental battle between two almost equal adversaries. And Satan keeps on harping the fact that God is made greater to him only by his thunder. Therefore, quite clearly, Milton is building Satan as the epic hero in order to facilitate this Christian battle between good and evil for the human soul. Now, please remember that this is only for Satan of book 1 and 4. By the fourth book, Satan's stature has diminished. And in the final books, of course, he is cast into a serpent and is almost powerless. So, when we talk about the heroic Satan, we are talking about Satan of books 1 and 2. As I was referring, Satan's chief power lies in his power of rhetoric, both in his exhortation to his fellow angels and also in his seduction of Eve. Now, in both cases, Satan seems to invoke a pattern of reason. The reason in book 1 is that God has defeated us because he is greater, because of thunder. Second is that God was a tyrant, therefore we rebelled against him. Third, it is better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Four, what though the field be lost, all is not lost, and we can build our kingdom here. And fifth is that to do good will never be your task, but only to follow a relentless path of evil. Similarly, in book 4, Satan highlights a kind of rationality to Eve to prove that she should actually access the fruit of knowledge. Now, while we admire Satan's steadfastness and determination to carry the battle forward, which is synonymous with the classical heroes' grit and courage, and while we admire Satan's leadership in provoking the fallen angels to a state of activity rather than a state of stupor, we need to carefully look at the issue of Satan's rationality. If God, and in the Miltonian God, the divinity is not merely a figure of predestination, but a God who affords the element of choice to the human being and to his angels. God is God in Milton because he's wise. And the element of the free will seems to be granted by God to a certain degree, both to the angels and to the humans. Therefore, if God is true rationality, then Satan emerges as a figurehead of false rationality, one who justifies evil with a falsity of reason. The obverse to Satan would have been the discourse of repentance and the acknowledgement of evil. But Satan purely treats the question of the battle between good and evil as a political battle between freedom and tyranny, notwithstanding the fact that in pandemonium he replicates the same order as in heaven of a degree of you know leadership by one individual only. So in that sense, Satan's plea for freedom from tyranny is a false rationality, and instead of obedience to God and obedience to the cause of good, he merely follows a complete path of evil. It is here that Milton creates Satan as God's binary, not merely in terms of good and evil in moral terms, but also in terms of wise good reason versus unethical, selfish reason. So, Milton is taking a problem of the Bible, a text of holiness, and imbuing a certain degree of contemporary political issues within Satan. It is very tempting to see Satan merely as a figurehead of freedom, like Prometheus, who rebels against a tyrannical god. And Milton's Puritan sympathies, his association with Cromwell, his writings on freedom of press, his refusal to see the king only as the possible absolute monarch, has led credence to the idea that Milton's attitude towards Satan is sympathetic. I would rather classify this attitude as ambivalent, where Satan opposes tyranny, Milton's latent sympathy seems to surface. At the same time, there is a moral dimension to Paradise Lost as well. Milton seems to see Satan's tyranny, Satan's rebellion as based on the same pattern of power that he protests against. And in doing so, he is protesting against the wiser rationality of divinity. And in doing so, he is using the strategy of guile and falsity, or rather falsehood, with the angels, as well as later on with Eve. So, in that sense, Milton's Satan is also alerting us to the seductive power of language, We need to be alert that at this time, the political and the religious battle between the different sects in England was also being carried out in numerous pamphlets and in print. And Milton was a part of this battle of ideas. He seems to recognize through Satan in the seductive power of language to create mayhem and raise a false battle against good. Now, Satan's heroic stature, as I pointed out, is generated by a number of epic elements. You have the epic simile, which raises him to the stature of an extraordinary archangel. His body, his shield, his spear, the sonority of his speeches, the use of hyperbole, the use of Latinate words with its original meaning in Latin, the use of oxymorons, the use of similes and metaphors recurrently in Satan's speeches, the use of the harsher consonants to provide Satan with a kind of a battle rhetoric, a rhetoric of a siege. Therefore, the qualities of Satan that Milton seems to foreground are leadership. Satan is a leader of men. His speeches have the power to rouse his enemies, to rouse his followers. Secondly, there is the element of Satan's courage. He's not ready to lose the battle, even though he has been cast into hell. Third, the power of the will. In fact, we are reminded of Sidney's defense of poetry, where Sidney seems to talk about the Renaissance infected will to challenge the given world order, or what he calls the erected wit. In that sense, many of the critics have drawn parallels between the Renaissance hero, especially characters like Macbeth or the Marlovian protagonists, with their infinite willpower to challenge and to chart new territories for them. In that sense, many critics have seen Satan as a kind of a pioneer who sort of plumbs the route to evil. The only point being here that we need to be alert that Milton is writing within a Christian epic tradition, within the Puritan tradition. And therefore, one needs to also carefully study the kind of associates that Milton Satan has. He has Moloch, he has Mammon, and he has Belial. So the three figures who symbolize violence, greed, and corruption. In that sense, the catalogue of followers that Milton provides to Satan also betray the value system that Satan seems to follow. Therefore, Milton seems to balance these two elements. While he imbues Satan with a degree of heroism, he's also carefully alerting us to the moral depravity within Satan and his followers. So, how do we look in conclusion at Satan's character? I think there are three elements which we must underline. The first is that Milton is trying to grapple with epic, classical, and Christian traditions. While he uses the strategies and the rhetoric of the classical epic, he has to also create and balance the structure of Christian morality. Therefore, what we observe is the creation of an epic hero who will engage in this eternal battle between good and evil. In that sense, Satan's is that epic anti-hero, and with his epic qualities, he draws our sympathy of courage, bravery, willingness to fight. At the same time, Milton is alerting us to Satan's perverted rationality, Satan leading the angels to a state of despair, Satan's cronies and associates as having a corrupted value system, Satan's own logic and rationality as essentially perverted, and finally, Satan's grasp over the power of language to seduce and therefore damn human souls. We will remember that it is Satan who will lead Adam and Eve away from the Garden of Eden. And finally, it is Satan who will be transformed from the power of language to the status of a serpent. So it is only Satan in book 1 and 2 who emerges as heroic. From book 4 onwards, Satan becomes much duller, and much more devious. So it is not sufficient only to see Satan as an epic hero through book 1 in Paradise Lost. We need to see Satan in the entire context. But in book 1, in order to generate this sense of eternal battle between good and evil, of the sense of the heroic, dramatic thrust of Paradise Lost, Satan is created as heroic. One also needs to figure that there is a latent Miltonic sympathy for Satan, in the sense that Satan emerges as a figure who at least protests against tyranny and the centralization of power and urges for more freedom. So, in that sense, Milton's Satan emerges as a figure of contemporary times, emerges with a degree of ambivalence, where Satan is, or rather, Milton is in sympathy with Satan's political ideas, but antithetical against his Christian ideas. And it is with the entire gamut of classical epic traditions that Satan is made heroic, even though Milton is highlighting the corruption at the core of Satan's existence. It is therefore with this issue of ambivalence that I would like to bring this discussion to a close. Please remember that in a few minutes, I will disconnect now, and in a few minutes' time, we will be back again with another issue, another central issue of Paradise Lost, the combination of the classical and the Christian epic traditions. So hold your horses and your questions if you have them. Type them at the end of the next lecture, and we'll take them there. See you in a few minutes with the classical and Christian elements in Paradise Lost, Book 1. Thank you very much for joining in.